This is why I love this community. You guys are so smart. Sometimes I get a comment that really makes me think. So a few weeks ago, I made a video asking, is Indigenous appeasement bankrupting Canada? This topic was based on an opinion piece I'd read on the Western Standard. I'll link the video after this if you want to watch it later. But the gist of that video was essentially that First Nations appear to be holding Canada back from building big infrastructure projects while continuing to receive funding from the government. I was reacting to that idea in my video. Anyways, on that video, I got this interesting comment. This comment comes from Migmore. Shout out to Migmore. I appreciate you. Anyways, I'll read the part of that comment that I found most interesting. Anyways, Migmore says, Canadians need to read a book. You want to appease First Nations? Release the funds from the Indian Royal Trust, where it's been estimated the account holds over $1 trillion. Honor treaty rights. You can't push my relatives off their ancestral lands to reservations, and then when you find out there are resources you want to exploit, blame them for not wanting destruction of their current plot. Interesting. So this comment got me curious. Is there really $1 trillion trust fund that the federal government is holding for First Nations? If true, that could mean that all this money we think the federal government gives First Nations is really just their money anyways. Like, it will mean the federal government is not really giving them anything that they do not own. $1 trillion is a lot of money. For context, the federal government will spend $32 billion on Indigenous affairs this year. This is peanuts compared to $1 trillion. That's why I was really curious about this. So I looked it up. Here's what I found. The Indian Trust Fund is an account that holds all the money collected, received, or held by the Crown for the use and benefit of First Nations. The money comes from things like lease revenues from reserved lands, which might come from things like oil and gas, agriculture, sale of surrendered lands and royalties, interest income. Historically, the government controlled the trust and used it to pay for treaty annuities, capital projects, and many other things, including infrastructure for settlers like canals and universities. The Indian Trust exists today within the Consolidated Revenue Fund of Canada, the general account where all taxes and revenues are deposited. So the real question is this account worth $1 trillion? So here's what I found about that. The maximum value that I have seen reported for that account was roughly $1.2 billion. Unfortunately, not 1 trillion, okay? Yellowhead Institute reports that the most recent available estimate of the cash in that account was actually $634 million, okay? I told you earlier that the federal government will spend $32 billion on Indigenous affairs this year. So even if all the money in that trust were to be given straight to First Nations, funding from the government probably represents 80 to 90% of the transfers that First Nations receive. Okay, just to clarify that. Anyways, thanks Migmore for the comment. Here's another comment I found interesting on that particular video. This one comes from TikTok. This one comes from Jasmine Alexander on TikTok. She says, Indigenous peoples in Canada have trust accounts managed by the feds. And yes, the government actually borrows our money to fund their projects. So no, we're not bankrupt in Canada. They've been using our funds for decades. Why are they acting like the money that was put into our trust for us is for them or anyone else? Again, mind blown, mind blown. Not only is there $1 trillion Indigenous trust fund, but the government borrows money from it as well. Like, these are the kinds of assertions I find very fascinating. So here's what I found on that. Well, first of all, I already told you the money is held in the Consolidated Revenue Fund of Canada, which is the general account the federal government uses for all its operations. While the government holds a certain amount in trust for Indigenous groups, it can and does use that money in the meantime, just like with other funds in the CRF. So that money is not just sitting there. It is being borrowed by the federal government. According to the Yellowhead Institute, some of the main beneficiaries of this trust fund money allocation included the City of Toronto, Law Society of Upper Canada, Montreal Turnpike Trust, just to mention a few. But a lot of this action where the government was borrowing money for other purposes beyond Indigenous affairs took place between 1830 and 1860. That's why a lot of these names that I just read are kind of strange. The important point is that many of these loans were never repaid, or they were paid back without interest. So possibly billions were stolen from Indigenous people through this practice of borrowing for purposes that do not directly serve Indigenous groups. Now, as I said, this was a practice in the 1800s. However, in 2009, we received some clarification on what is the modern practice in terms of handling Indigenous trust. In 2009, the Samson First Nation and the Emiskin First Nation sued Canada for the loss of millions of potential income due to the Crown's abysmal investment of their monies in trust. The Treaty 6 bands allege that Ottawa was using the Indian trust account as a low-cost source of loans. Half the trust was their money at that point, and their claim was that if the fund was managed by a private sector administrator, they would have earned more in interest. The Supreme Court of Canada unanimously ruled, however, that Canada is not liable when it fails to make money on the First Nations deposits through investments, and in fact, that the Indian Act makes this kind of investment illegal. This means the government isn't required to manage these funds like a private investment firm. It is only obligated to hold and protect the funds, not grow them. So what happens today? What happens today? First Nations trust money is now typically held in consolidated revenue accounts or specific purpose trusts. The federal government does not actively loan it out anymore, nor does it use it to fund public works. But here's the problem here. The funds are usually held in very conservative, low-interest accounts like government bonds. First Nations cannot easily invest or grow their own money unless they opt out of the Indian Act system. So now some nations are creating their own trusts and financial institutions to manage these funds independently. Others are entering self-government agreements or using the First Nations Fiscal Management Act to manage revenues, investments, and loans more freely. And that brings me to the last comment I want to highlight today. This one is from Systema Strong on YouTube. In reference to the money the federal government spends on Indigenous affairs each year, Systema Strong says that money goes to lawyers and contractors picked by the Crown. Consultation is simply a notification. Give the bands even half the money and agency and watch the boil notices diminish. Might be time to take their land out of trust and simply give them real sovereignty. Look, I think I agree with a lot of that. I would like to see Indigenous peoples manage their own wealth. Perhaps if they have more of a stake in some of these nation building projects we're talking about today, maybe there'll be less opposition to fundamental projects that could benefit us all. All right? That's all I'll say about that. Anyways, those are the comments I wanted to highlight today. You know what? I might make more of these videos where I react to your comments. So if you put a comment in the chat, make it a good one. I get some really, really intellectual discussions in the comments sometimes, and I love that. I absolutely love that. We don't have to agree on everything. Feel free to call me on anything you don't agree with. Also, subscribe if you're new to the channel. I am 40 subscribers away from 1,000 on YouTube right now. Mind blown. When I started this thing, I didn't expect it to come this far, but here we are. It is really important to me that I reach that milestone of 1,000 on YouTube. The channel is the Wolf of Young Street podcast on YouTube. So please subscribe on YouTube. Help us out there. Please go over there and subscribe. It is free to you, but it helps more channels like this one. So please subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you next time. Take care, you guys.